Good evening and welcome to the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas online public lecture series. Firstly, as a reflection of this institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge that the traditional owners, the Palawa peoples, and custodians of the land upon which we meet and pay respect to their elders past, present and future. My name's Dr. Matt Killingsworth. I am the Head of Politics and International Relations here at the University of Tasmania. I am also the Chair of the Tasmanian International Humanitarian Law Advisory Committee. So in that respect, I'm both delighted and privileged to be chairing this evening's Island of Ideas series. Before I ask Vice Chancellor Rufus Black to introduce this evening's speaker, a couple of things that I need to mention and a bit of background to the Island of Ideas, which commenced last year to keep the ideas flowing during a period which we were unable to host live public events. The program will continue throughout 2021 while we maintain strong physical distancing measures to ensure the safety of students, staff and the community. So some housekeeping, your microphone, camera, chat function and raised hand function have all been disabled. So our speakers are not interrupted. However, we do encourage you to ask questions, and this can be done at any time by typing them into the Q&A function. And I'll be collating those questions and asking our guest speaker to address them in the latter half of our presentation this evening. We'll also be conducting a couple of audience polls, the first of which you can probably see now on your screens. So please feel free to participate if you would like to. And finally, this lecture is being recorded for later access on our YouTube and SoundCloud channels. Now I'd like to introduce the Vice Chancellor of the University of Tasmania, Professor Rufus Black, to provide the official welcome.
Thank you very much, Matt. Well, welcome everyone to the 15th Red Cross Oration, an annual lecture which springs from a collaboration between the University of Tasmania and the Australian Red Cross, stretching back to 2007. The purpose of this event is to contribute to the advancement of public understanding and interdisciplinary dialogue concerning issues of human significance in the contemporary world. The oration is presented by an internationally renowned speaker, introducing to the wider community issues that connect broadly with the values and principles of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. The talk alternates each year between a theme related to international humanitarian law and the work with communities on the ground performed so admirably by the Australian Red Cross. This year, the Oration Committee seeks to highlight the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which came into force in January following ratification by 50 nations. Its selection, I think, is extraordinarily timely in an era regionally and globally where we face a new time of strategic competition. To be reflecting on this is important for all of us. So this evening, to help us with that task, I'd especially like to welcome our speaker, Beatrice Fihn, to our virtual campus tonight, as well as Tara Goodman, who represents the Australian Red Cross. But to all of you attending online this evening, thank you for joining us. And I'm sure you will have plenty to think about after this year's oration. So a very warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor. It's now my pleasure to introduce my friend and Australian Red Cross colleague, Ms. Tara Goodman, who's the National Manager for Government Relations at Australian Red Cross. And Tara is going to introduce the oration and this evening's speaker. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you, Matt. It is a real honour to be here with you all tonight, or to be there with you all in the fine city of Hobart. I'm coming to you from Canberra, which is Ngunnawal country, and I pay my respects to the traditional owners of Ngunnawal land and expressly to their elders, past, present and emerging. And on behalf of Australian Red Cross, I warmly welcome you all, and I welcome the inimitable Beatrice Fihn for her first, I believe, virtual visit to Tasmania. But before doing so, first up, there's something I'd like to create an association in your mind before we kick off. And I want to create an association that you might not be aware of. I'm wondering what you think of when I say Red Cross. What do you associate Red Cross with? Is it volunteers in emergencies and crisis situations? Is it the blood bank? Perhaps you're a blood donor yourself. If you're local to Tasmania, it might be the community-based health and first aid programs we run in prisons there that reduce reoffending locally in your community. All that is well and good. But from now on, when you hear Red Cross, I'd like to form a new association, and I'd like you to think of something new. This might be a bit controversial, and goodness knows we don't like to be too controversial at Red Cross, but in keeping within the realms of the fundamental principles, I'd like you henceforth, from this day, I'd be very grateful if you would firmly associate us with international crimes. Yep, I said international crimes, because international crime is a significant part of what we do. I'm not suggesting that we're pirates or money launderers or running drug cartels, certainly not. Donors, relax. But in our International Humanitarian Law Department, worldwide, Red Cross is knee-deep in international crime. Not doing it, but making it. So for 7 years, we have tried to make the use of nuclear weapons a crime internationally. We want it to be a crime everywhere on the planet to develop, use, test nuclear weapons, to produce them, to acquire them, to possess, stockpile, or threaten to use them. Beatrice's organisation, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, wants this too. And although we may have different ways of approaching it from time to time, our goal is the same. You might say that we're partners in crime. Our motivation for doing this, however, as Red Cross, is because we are well aware of the humanitarian consequences of the use and the testing of nuclear weapons. And it's very easy for people and countries with their hands on the levers of power to dismiss calls for the elimination of nuclear weapons as naive or Pollyanna-ish. Some suggest that we are too dove-like to play in this hawkish field of national security, and that our security really depends on the existence of nuclear weapons. But our position that nuclear weapons must be eliminated is purely a pragmatic one. In fact, just like the chief medical officers whose guidance has led us through the COVID response, our position is evidence-based, data-driven, and informed by our own experience in Hiroshima. And democratic governments all agree that these are the criteria for creating good policy. The notion that nuclear weapons keeps us safe is based only on circumstantial evidence, namely that there hasn't been a nuke used since 1945. The mutually assured destruction or deterrence theory is just that, a theory that only works until the day that it doesn't. Nuclear weapons were used in Japan, and even today at Red Cross hospitals, 76 years on, we continue to treat thousands of survivors of the use of those weapons, and also now the next generation, their children who continue to be impacted by illnesses as a result of radiation that their parents were exposed to. Under international humanitarian law, numerous weapons have already been banned. Chemical weapons, biological weapons, landmines, blinding laser weapons, and others have been entirely outlawed. So it is high time to add nuclear weapons to this list of prohibited weapons. To illuminate you further on this topic, I take great pleasure in introducing Beatrice Fihn, who is the Executive Director of ICAN. ICAN was, of course, the winner of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. You don't get better than that. Beatrice's background is in security policy and disarmament. She was listed as an innovator who changed the global landscape by Bloomberg Media. She's also been the executive producer of a film, The Day the World Changed, which I recommend to you. It's an interactive virtual reality memorial that pays tribute to those affected by war. So whilst Red Cross has stepped forward from our experiences in 1945 in Hiroshima, ICANN has approached this from the other end. Where do we want to be? How do we get there? They've started with the treaty. They've achieved this treaty January 22 this year. That treaty entered into force for all 52 countries who've signed and ratified. So nuclear weapons are banned in those countries. And I hand you now to our partner in crime, Beatrice Fihn, who continues to work to ensure that this is a global international crime. Thank you, Beatrice.
Thank you very much, Tara, and thank you, Rufus. It's such a great honor to be with you today, and I really, really wish I could have been there in person. And thank you very much. I really like the idea of being partners in crime on this issue. And I want to talk a little bit about the need for prevention today. We must prevent what we cannot cure. And it was the representatives from the Red Cross that established that there is no medical response capacity, no cure for the humanitarian catastrophe that would be wrought by the detonation of just one nuclear weapon. After the first nuclear weapons were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, reported horror-struck about the humanitarian travesty and the decimation of the medical response capacity in those cities. About 80% of the hospitals in Hiroshima, and out of 300 doctors, 270 died or were injured. Out of over 1,700 nurses, around 1,600 were killed or injured. And reporting on the conditions at an emergency hospital in Hiroshima, the ICRC's Fritz Bilfinger wrote, medical equipment was practically non-existent. The place looked more like a morgue than an emergency hospital. And today, more than 75 years later, there's no indication that cities today would fare any better after a nuclear explosion. And every year, nuclear armed states and allies participate in training exercises to prepare to launch these weapons of mass destruction, thousands of which they keep on high alert, ready to launch within minutes. They practice flying planes that would drop nuclear weapons. They train new personnel. And in some cases, they practice coordinating with supportive countries. They spend billions of dollars each year to build new nuclear weapons and keep the 13,000 existing weapons of mass destruction and to develop new options for their use. But what they never really do prepare for is what comes next after the bombs are dropped. They do not prepare for the hundreds of thousands of burn victims, for the blasted hospitals, for the injured or dying medical professionals who are left alone to try to heal an entire city. As the Red Cross movement and medical associations have warned repeatedly, they cannot prepare to respond to a humanitarian catastrophe on this scale. Nuclear weapons constitute the greatest immediate threat to health and welfare of mankind, wrote the World Health Organization in a 1984 report. It is obvious that no health service in any area of the world would be capable of dealing adequately with the hundreds of thousands of people seriously injured by blast, heat, or radiation from even one single 1 megaton bomb. Whatever remained of the medical services in the world could not alleviate the disaster in any significant way, they said. But even the detonation of just 100 kiloton nuclear weapon over a major city would leave hundreds of thousands to over 1 million people injured. It takes 10 seconds for the fireball of a nuclear explosion to reach its maximum size. A nuclear explosion releases vast amounts of energy in the form of blast, heat, and radiation. An enormous shock wave reaches speeds of many hundreds of kilometers an hour. The blast kills people close to ground zeros and causes lung injuries, ear damage, internal bleeding further away. People sustain injuries from collapsing buildings and flying objects. Thermal radiation is so intense that almost everything close to ground zero is vaporized. The extreme heat causes severe burns and ignites fires over a large area, which coalesce into a giant firestorm. Even people in underground shelters face likely death due to a lack of oxygen and carbon monoxide poisoning. There will be nowhere near enough hospital beds, doctors, nurses, ICU beds, or burn care centers to treat all the patients. Every remaining hospital bed or surviving doctor would suddenly have to accommodate dozens, if not hundreds, of badly injured patients while coping with basic utility failures. People within 4 kilometers of every direction from the detonation point would suffer third-degree burns, but many cities' burn beds number in the single digits. Medical infrastructure would be overwhelmed by the times more new patients in one city in 1 second than new COVID-19 patients in one day in the entire country at the peak of the pandemic. And even if just one average-sized nuclear weapon, around 100 kilotons, will be to detonate over a large city today, the immediate health impact would be catastrophic. 1 out of 5 people would die instantly or be injured. Encircling a little over 1 kilometer from the detonation point would likely be a fatal dose of ionizing radiation. And within like 3.5 kilometers in every direction of the center, there would be blast damage with more residential buildings collapsing and local fires starting from the destruction. Everyone in this zone would be injured and many would die. And within 4.5 kilometers, people would suffer third-degree burns on all exposed skin. A full 9 kilometers from the center of the blast, glass windows can be expected to shatter, causing additional injuries to anyone in the vicinity. How could any city respond to a health crisis of this proportion? And yet, in many ways, these numbers are actually best-case scenarios. It only measures the impact of one average-sized nuclear weapon within the first few hours of detonation. It does not measure the impact of some modern nuclear weapons, which are many more times powerful, nor does it consider the radiation that would sicken and kill many people over time, the long-term environmental and climate change damage, or the escalating nuclear war that a nuclear strike over a nuclear-armed state's city was almost certainly trigger. The trauma of overwhelmed hospitals and overburdened doctors and nurses around the world who are struggling to meet the needs of patients during the COVID-19 pandemic shows just how impossible it would be for medical infrastructure to respond to even one nuclear weapon. We have seen the overfull morgues and the refrigerated trucks of corpses in hospital parking lots. And sadly, it is clear that a nuclear attack would be much, much worse. Roughly 1 year into the pandemic, the United States recently commemorated 500,000 of its people who died from COVID-19. Immediately after one single nuclear bomb on Washington, D.C., about that many people would be injured or killed instantly, while hospital supplies and medical personnel will be simultaneously drastically reduced and public utility access will be threatened. It took countries around the world months to increase their medical supplies, from hospital beds to ICU beds to ventilators, to care for the overwhelming number of patients. We know now how unprepared we were for an emergency that experts had warned us would happen. And this scenario that I'm talking about nuclear weapons detonations, it isn't just hypothetical. The risk of nuclear weapons use is actually increasing right now. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists with their doomsday clock say that the risk of nuclear war is as high as it was during the height of the Cold War. And as an example, just recently, a Stanford professor presented a paper that calculated the risk of nuclear weapons use. And he concluded that a child born today has a greater chance to experience nuclear use than not. And I think we're not really reflecting on that as a society, that a child born today has a greater chance to see a nuclear weapon being used than not. We must prevent what cannot cure. And in addition to documenting the humanitarian impacts of war, the Red Cross movement has also been the leading organization in promoting international law to regulate the horrors of war, to protect civilians and combatants. From the Geneva Conventions to the most recent conventions regulating weapons, the Red Cross has been at the forefront, providing legal expertise and advocating for greater legal protections for people in and surrounded by armed conflict. And recently, the ICRC and the movement and its national societies, and in particularly the Australian Red Cross, has played such a crucial role alongside ICANN and the survivors of nuclear weapons use and testing, in advocating for the negotiations of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the first international treaty to ban nuclear weapons and provide a pathway towards their elimination. And consistent with the humanitarian vision of its founder, Henry Dunant, the ICRC first called for nuclear weapons to be banned in September 1945, just weeks after the first atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Since then, it's repeatedly warned that nuclear weapons will not spare hospitals, prisoners of war camps, and civilians, and their inevitable consequences is extermination. In 2010, the Committee of the Red Cross adopted the prohibition of the nuclear weapons as one of its top priorities. The disproportionate and indiscriminate destructiveness of the use of a nuclear weapon on a city is clearly a violation of international humanitarian law. Nuclear weapons cannot distinguish between military and civilian targets, between combatants and non-combatants. Most of the casualties of a nuclear attack would inevitably be civilians. And once the explosive energy of a nuclear chain reaction has been released, it cannot be contained. People in neighboring and distant countries who have nothing to do with the conflict would suffer the effects of radioactive fallout, even if they were at a safe distance from the blast and the thermal destruction near ground zero. The catastrophic health and environmental consequences of nuclear war are at the extreme end of a continuum of armed violence that undermines health and security. Outlawing and eliminating nuclear weapons is a part of a broader struggle for genuinely human-centered security, founded on respect for basic rights, rights to education, healthcare, decent work, and a clean environment. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is the first international treaty to begin to address these humanitarian impacts by requiring states parties to provide assistance for victims of nuclear weapons use and testing, and to begin to remediate contaminated environments. Countries where nuclear armed states tested their nuclear weapons, such as Algeria, Kiribati, Kazakhstan, support this treaty. The treaty is a rejection of the racism and colonialism that nuclear armed states testing their nuclear weapons on their former colonies and indigenous people. And the TPNW is a landmark achievement for international humanitarian law and international security. And it's an incredible step towards a world without nuclear weapons. The treaty now has 86 signatures and 54 states parties. Each of these countries is leading the way forward to a world without nuclear weapons. It entered into force on 22nd of January this year, and the first meeting of states parties will take place in January next year in Vienna in Austria. And this will be a really important and very exciting meeting to bring the treaty to life and to discuss further actions to implement the provisions and increase the membership of the treaty. But meanwhile, in countries that had not yet joined the treaty, including Australia, people are speaking up against nuclear weapons and calling on their countries to join. Pressure on these countries is growing because of the treaty. Cities around the world, for example, the places that would be the targets of these weapons, like Berlin, Paris, and Washington, DC, are adopting resolutions calling on their government to join the TPNW. In fact, the very first city to sign the ICANN Cities Appeal was Melbourne, followed soon by Sydney. And we are really, really delighted that the city of Hobart is also on board, part of this growing movement of cities internationally that are supporting the treaty. And public opinion, regular people want this treaty. They want their governments to join the treaty. From Australia to Canada, Germany, Japan, the UK, polls shows that the majority of people want their government to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Thousands of parliamentarians have pledged to work to bring their respective countries on board. In Australia, 88 of the current members of parliament has taken ICANN's pledge. Change is not only possible, it's inevitable. And the case for Australia's accession to the treaty is laid out in compelling detail in the report Choosing Humanity, published by ICANN Australia in 2019. And it actually includes a section by Tara from the Australian Red Cross, which showcased the strong and growing support that exists in Australia for this crucial piece of new international law. As some of you know, ICANN was founded in Australia in 2007. by a small group of people with a big vision, with an abundance of passion, creativity, and courage, and of course also an eye kangaroo as a mascot. They wanted not only to warn humanity of the horrors of nuclear weapons, but also to inspire us all to believe that a nuclear weapons-free world is possible and within our reach, instead of simply accepting the dangerous status quo as the permanent state of affairs. And over the years, they have worked to amplify the voices of First Nations people in Australia and in the Pacific, who continue to suffer the horrendous impacts of nuclear tests carried out on their lands and in their waters by the United Kingdom, the United States, and France. In Vienna in 2014, I had the privilege of meeting Sue Coleman Hazeldine, an Aboriginal nuclear test survivor from the Kokata Nation of South Australia. She delivered an incredibly powerful statement at this major conference on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons, attended by representatives of 158 governments. And I would like to conclude today with her words. Our old people remembered the good life of hunting for wild game and collecting bush fruits. Life was healthy. There were still Aboriginal people living and traveling this way in the Emu Field and Maralinga region, where the bomb tests started. The government was no good at ensuring that everyone was safe. It really didn't care what happened to Aboriginal people. We are telling the story so our history is not forgotten, but also to create a better future for all people all over the world. If you love your own children and care for the children of the world, you will find the courage to stand up and say enough, always keeping in mind that the future forever belongs to the next generation. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Beatrice. Thank you so very much. You've done a number of things in your amazing presentation. I think you've both through, I guess, data demonstrated to us the horrible destructive effects of nuclear weapons, but also the post effects of nuclear weapons as well, that as a weapon of mass destruction. And I was privileged enough to be at the peace ceremony in Hiroshima, which commemorates the dropping of the bomb there. And it is a stark reminder when you attend something like that or listen to your presentation of the effect that the dropping of a nuclear weapon has, not just in the immediacy of that weapon being dropped, but also afterwards as well. And you also mentioned, which I think was also really important for some of the questions that we've had asked as well, is that there does seem to be a degree of complacency with respects to the danger and simultaneously the threat of these weapons at the moment. And I think if you believe the popular press, at least here in Australia, that there is impending conflict between two nuclear-armed countries, the United States and China. So again, I think your presentation has both revealed that I hope has sort of taken us out of our complacency by revealing the horrendous nature of these weapons, but also reminding us as well about that we have to be very careful with our complacency too. We have a number of questions, and I'm really proud to say that the first one has come with something that you mentioned. It's local, and it's a question with regards to Australia's I don't know if refusal is too strong a word, but the fact that they are not a signatory to the treaty. They provide essentially two reasons for this. They make the argument that it would violate their treaty obligations. And they also make the argument that as none of the 5 non-proliferation treaty nuclear weapon states have also not signed the treaty, they argue about its efficiency. Does it matter that those 5 sort of declared countries haven't signed it? And B, what do we need to do to work harder to get Australia to sign this treaty?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think it's really important that we do talk about the specificities around nuclear weapons use, because the nuclear armed states love to talk about it as a security instrument, but never about the consequences. They want to talk about the theory, never reality. And I think it's really important that people are grounded in the facts and in the reality of this weapon. That it's not just wishful thinking that we can have these forever and never see them used. in terms of the lack of joining the treaty from the nuclear armed state side, it's not necessarily a problem at this stage. Of course, that is our end goal, to get the countries with nuclear weapons to join this treaty and to eliminate their nuclear arsenals. But it really starts with us. And I think that that's what we see with a lot of other movements, that norms and change of behavior comes when people around you change. It is impossible for a country like Russia or the United States or China to change, but not even Australia can stand up and say no to nuclear weapons. So it really starts with countries like Australia to build a new norm, to raise expectations on how we behave. It's very easy sometimes to say that, you know, people have this image of international law or diplomacy as it's not efficient, it doesn't work, these treaties don't matter. It's like some sort of popular kind of imagery of international law as ineffective, which is really far away from true when you look at facts. These treaties have hugely shifted countries' behavior. If you look at how governments behaved 100 years ago and how they behave now, not saying that it's flawless and it always works, and there are no exceptions, of course, countries violate international law all the time, but the fact that the laws exist raises the expectations. We notice when they violate laws. And we protest against that. So that means that it's kind of working. We've seen, for example, on the Chemical Weapons Convention, there was a huge outrage when Syria used chemical weapons. Syria hadn't joined the treaty on banning chemical weapons at that point. So technically, I guess it was legal for them, but that doesn't matter because there was an expectation, because there was a new international law, there was an expectation in society, in the world, that that's not behavior that you do. North Korea hasn't joined the treaty that bans nuclear testing, yet the entire world joins in condemning this, putting pressure, sanctions, pressuring North Korea, saying that's unacceptable behavior because there is a treaty. So these treaties, you know, it doesn't happen fast. International law is a long process, but they drastically change state behavior. And what we're seeing with the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons is that it's already putting a lot of pressure on these countries, raising the expectations that the public have on their governments, and kind of breaks the 75-year-long indoctrination that this is normal. We have 75 years when it's been legal for these countries to have these weapons, and we're just starting to undo that. And that is going to change how we see it and what we're asking our governments to do in the future. And when it comes to Australia, getting the Australian government to join the treaty, we have to be louder. I think one of the difficulties that we have in civil society is that public opinion is with us, but there are so many issues. It's climate change, it's a pandemic, there's so many other issues that are going on that people aren't expressing that belief in nuclear disarmament as loudly as they could. So we have to find ways to really make sure that the politicians hear us when we don't just say, I like that, I want nuclear disarmament. I mean, most people want, but we have to be a little bit sharper and tougher on our governments. And there's also so many different things that people can do based on their, you know, which community they belong to, which role they have in society. We have, for example, cities speaking up. An amazing number of Australian cities have taken the position to support the treaty and urge the government to join. And that is currently putting pressure on governments. Parliamentarians, as I mentioned, over 88 parliamentarians in Australia have signed the pledge. So people need to tell their local representatives that they need to sign this pledge. They need to speak out on this. They need to hear from their constituencies. If you're a banker, for example, I mean, the amount of money that people, even Australian banks, provide to the companies that build weapons of mass destruction is enormous. We can also start on the divestment side, for example, asking banks, pension funds to divest from nuclear weapons. And, you know, like ICAN Australia will have all of these actions and different projects on their website. So I really recommend people to go in there and look. But most of all, I think it's really important to be loud, to dare to speak out on this and to feel like we actually have the possibility to do something about this. And if Australia would join this treaty, it would have a huge impact. I mean, this is actually something where Australia could contribute to changing the world. if Australia would join this treaty, it would put enormous amount of pressure on the nuclear armed states, on other countries that participate in nuclear weapons exercises. So really, it would really matter if the Australian government joined this treaty.
I tend to agree, and I think it would reinforce the idea that Australia likes to present of itself as a good international citizen as well, and as a sort of a middle power that can encourage through persuasion other states to behave in a good way. I also like your point about sort of the normative effect of international law as well, that there's two things sort of simultaneously going on here, that there's both public opinion, as you pointed, or global civil society informing the creation of the law. And then in turn, having the law allows us to point out bad behaviour as well. And this sort of relationship between that, I think, is brilliant. And the final point you made, I think, is really important as well, the grassroots aspect of this. And we've seen success with this with climate change as well, of banks, for example, in Australia, no longer willing to lend money, for example, to large projects that they believe, for example, are for non-renewable energy examples. So I think the parallels there are really valuable as well. The next question we have from our participants this evening is with respects to dismantling rather than disarmament. So I wanted to ask you, with respects to the treaty, obviously it's related to the use of weapons, but is there an aspect of this that also facilitates the dismantling of weapons as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's really part of the treaty, right? Like that there's provisions in the treaty for eliminating nuclear weapons and dismantling them. And that, of course, needs to involve the countries that actually have the weapons. But so we need to build the political will to get there. Right now, one of the issues we've had with previous treaties that have dismantled weapons is that they've been very much missing the delegitimization of nuclear weapons. You have, for example, these reduction treaties, arms control agreements that caps the levels at certain places and facilitate the reduction, which is great and really needed. There was an enormous amount of nuclear weapons. We've come a long way since the height of the Cold War in terms of the numbers of nuclear weapons. But these agreements, they still kind of recognize the value of nuclear weapons, that these are weapons that keep us safe. So it's like an inherent contradiction in arms control and these kind of dismantling initiatives that we had in the past, where we are lowering the numbers and dismantling weapons, but they're really good for security and we need them to protect us. And those two things are sort of contradictory, like why reduce the number of a weapon that protects you? Like, and that's where you also open up for example, in the United States, Republicans blocking that in the Senate to move ahead with further reductions, because you haven't convinced people that these are actually a security threat. It's more like a giant radioactive security blanket for them. So really, this treaty tries to do both, right? It tries to kind of make this clear line about the unacceptability of nuclear weapons and try to get people used to the idea and kind of change minds that these weapons are actually unnecessary. We don't need them. They are a huge threat to our security. They're not protecting us. They are threatening us, and they are actively harming people still. And that's why we need to dismantle them, and that's why we need to work in the same way as we did with chemical weapons and biological weapons. Once the nuclear armed states sign this treaty, it will take time to dismantle nuclear weapons. Like the actual dismantling, the physical dismantling needs to be done safely, environmentally friendly. We've created a lot of problems by building these weapons that we're going to have to solve. But it's really important that we get them on board with the sort of idea that these weapons have no place in the world today, and then get to work on the dismantlement. So
this is a nice segue into Harriet's question about, and there's two parts I wanted to ask you. So Harriet asks about, and you talk about the frustration sort of contradiction of weapons. And I was reminded of trying to teach mutually assured destruction to undergraduates and this sort of the very apt acronym of MAD. And so and this is Harriet's question on the value of deterrence and sort of moving away from that Cold War paradigm of deterrence is the best way. So I wondered if you could perhaps address that a little bit as well, please.
Absolutely. I think we have, the biggest problem that we have that stands between us and a world without nuclear weapons is this idea that more weapons make you safer, like, and the bigger bombs you have, the better you're off. And it's a sign of power and protection. And by giving up, by negotiating disarmament, you are somehow reducing your safety and security. And it's a really flawed way of looking at security. And I think that, to be honest, I see that this past year with the COVID-19, but also the huge challenges that climate change are posing to the world, really emphasizes that the security threats today and in the foreseeable future are not an invasion of another country. That's not how these countries compete with each other anymore either, or threaten each other. You can see, for example, in the US, I mean, Russia kind of shook the US with a couple of Facebook accounts. Not with weapons of mass destructions. I mean, the way we've seen, like, cyber attacks, for example, but also these kind of other issues like, pandemics, climate change. I mean, that's really the idea that weapons would solve our security problems is really naive and unrealistic. And, I think that there's ways that we have to kind of challenge that notion that weapons provide us with security. And I think we can do that in a couple of different ways. First, the humanitarian impact, and focus on what happens in reality when these weapons are used. I think that's a really powerful way of challenging deterrence. These decision makers that have these war games plans on using nuclear weapons, they stop their exercise and simulations after the nuclear weapons are used. They map out these war scenarios, and we will do this, and then Russia will do that, or China will do that, and then we use nuclear weapons there, and then they stop. And that, to me, is completely naive, right? Like, you have to prepare for what happens afterwards. So we have to focus on the humanitarian stuff to challenge that notion, because they have no answers when it comes to those questions. When it comes to actually nuclear weapons in reality, they have no answers. And second, I think we really have to use this momentum we have in the world now to ask, whose security are we talking about? Nuclear weapons mainly protects the power and the prestige of some individuals in some countries, in a very few countries. Like, it's a tool for the very powerful and privileged to feel even more powerful. But at the same time, this tool that is meant for security harms people. It harms people where nuclear weapons have been tested today. It will harm people in the areas where they're used. And I think that ties very well in together with the conversations about, who's going to be impacted by climate change. It's not going to be the rich people in Washington and London and Moscow. Like, it's going to be, people of color, people from poorer countries, people who don't have the abilities to address those security threats in the same way. Or just the anti-racism movement that we see over the world, like an institution like the police, for example, is meant to protect this is institution, security system meant to protect people, but it actually harms people, and harms people of color disproportionately. And it's the same thing with nuclear weapons. We need to kind of open up also the question of security, who has a voice in this field, who do we listen to? And when it comes to Australia, we need to listen to the communities that were impacted of nuclear testing. Their voices of what protects us is really important. And the third thing, I think it's also important to think of it, I'm Swedish, and the idea of feminist foreign policy, for example, this idea of also re-evaluating what is strength, what is rational, and what is sort of, how do we approach these issues? There's this very ingrained notion that weapons equal strength. Prioritizing healthcare, education is seen as soft issues, weak. Diplomacy, disarmament is seen as weak, feminine. And I think that's extremely important to challenge because, again, based in facts, that kind of policy actually protects people better. People in communities with a lot of weapons are more harmed by weapons than people in communities where you invest that kind of money in healthcare, education. So it's actually a really bad security strategy, and it actually harms your people. But it's somehow we've created a society where that's seen as strong and rational when it's really weak, emotional, and kind of, it doesn't make any sense, but I'm just going to collect lots of weapons and feel safe, even if I'm actually risking a lot more in that way. So I think that there's all these ways that we have to challenge this kind of fixed notions of what security is, how deterrence works, and how we protect ourselves. And I do feel like, diversity and new voices, and having regular people speak out, and not just leave it to a very small group of, defense thinkers or, very privileged people in governments to make these decisions for us, but to really make this an issue that people can speak up on.
So you raise another excellent point with regards to the inequality of the current regime as it exists. And so the idea that there are 5 declared nuclear weapon states who simultaneously reserve the right to keep theirs, and some of them reserve the right to use theirs, while telling everyone else they can't have them. And sort of then wondering why it is that other countries seek to develop them for security reasons. And so that's an excellent, the inequality of that, the unfairness of sort of pre-existing powers is a really good point. The other question, and this has been raised by a number of people in our Q&A so far, and it's that what it is that you're aiming to do. Does it become more difficult in a heightened security environment such as what we're in at the moment, when, as you've identified a number of times, that in a heightened security environment, the dominant discourse becomes bigger, better, harder bombs?
Yeah, and I think that's really the key. I mean, and it should be the opposite, of course. In a more tense world, that when it really becomes urgent. But unfortunately, we've seen, for example, historically, when we started the work with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and the sort of idea was to form that we were starting with the first meetings on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. This was during the time, President Obama and President Medvedev had just signed the New START Treaty. We had a positive outcome of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Medvedev even showed up at a NATO meeting as an observer. It was like the good days. And this was before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But then the argument was, oh, everything is fine. We don't need to do anything now. There's no worry. Like, we don't come with the nuclear disarmament issue now, because everything is fine, and just leave us. And then when there's more tension, oh no, well, now is a really bad time, because now it's really tension. And in a way, it reminds me a little bit of smokers, right? Like, well, it's not a good time because I'm really stressed. And it's not going to be a good time now because I'm on holiday. And it's not a good time now because, it's not a good time right now. I mean, there's always an excuse, right? So there's never a good time. There's never going to be a moment when the nuclear armed states say, oh, we feel completely comfortable to get rid of our nuclear weapons. That's not how change happens. That's not how powerful people give up their privilege. Never. It's never going to be comfortable. It's always going to be friction. It's always going to be needing an external push from someone else saying that, no, you have to do it, and we have to force you to do it. And that's the case of all privileges. I mean, men didn't just give the women the right to vote just to be nice, and they felt that it was time, right? It was the women's movement who said, like, we're demanding this, right? Like, you can't stop us. We're going to go ahead and do this. And it's the same thing with all these other causes. So I really do think that we have to listen to the countries that want to keep nuclear weapons, to dictate the pace and to dictate the rules for how this is going to be done, and listen to the countries that have had the impact of nuclear weapons, and listen to the people who don't want them, really. And to be honest, I mean, the security situation also comes with a much higher risk. And I mentioned it a little bit in my lecture, that the risk is increasing right now, and it's lots of different reasons for that. You have the increased tensions, and not just China and the US, or China and Russia, but also India, Pakistan, who just last year almost went, had an escalating armed conflict between each other, and where their military advisors the generals sat down and started mapping out options for nuclear weapons use. And that would be devastating if they went to nuclear war with each other. It would be devastating for the climate, for global crops. Would be mass starvation all over the world if that happened. But you also have India and China, for example, also have a border conflict and rising tensions. You have, of course, in the Middle East, ongoing tension, and North Korea is still an issue. So I think that there's so many different, the more nuclear armed states than ever, and so many different sort of ways of the conflict, almost like a net But then you also have technological development. The military is changing its operation to a very high-tech kind of environment with cyber attacks, artificial intelligence, and it also speeds up decision-making and speeds up the process of warfare, really. And in those situations, you can see, and a lot of experts have talked about this, how nuclear weapons can become an easier option earlier in the conflict because of all of these high tech, and how it can trigger a very rapid escalation of conflict, meaning that we have a higher likelihood of seeing the use of nuclear weapons, or just a fear from these countries that they can knock out our entire infrastructure through hacking. So we better use nuclear weapons first, early in the conflict, for example. So you have all these kind of dynamics that increases the risk of nuclear weapons use. That means that this heightened tension is really makes it very urgent that we move forward and that we reduce the risk by banning and eliminating nuclear weapons.
I know that, and I agree with you when you say that there's limited value in focusing on nuclear weapon states who have been reluctant for all of the reasons you mentioned. One of the questions, though, in our Q&A, I am interested to hear your thoughts, and you speak of good times. I wonder if you think the election or the change of administration in the US might perhaps be one of those good times with the election of President Biden.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, obviously we still have to focus on the nuclear arms states. They are still essential actors and like the central actors in this field, and they are the ones who have to disarm. But I think that's also the power of a coalition like ICAN, is that each government has a role to play, so which means that we can ask each person to also mobilize their own government. Because in the past, it's been very much, if it's only the US and Russia that can do something, what does an Australian have to do with this? And how can a regular Australian citizen play a role in this? And it makes people a bit passive. So I think that the idea that each country can put additional pressure on the nuclear arms states makes it also much more possible for people all around the world to take action and find things to do and find ways to expressing their support for nuclear disarmament. And I think that, honestly, I was terrified during the 4 years of Trump. It was, a president who intentionally unravels treaties and, goes into very kind of hostile situations with other countries. However, the nuclear weapons remain. And they have remained under Obama, under Bush, under Trump, and now also under Biden. A positive thing was, of course, that they extended the New START, the cap on nuclear weapons arsenals between Russia and the United States very early, just a week after, I think, President Biden took office. So I think it's a little bit of a mix, right? I mean, obviously, it's better to have someone who is less irrational as the president, but at the same time, who do you trust with ending the world? I mean, the US president has the sole authority to decide whether or not to basically wipe out the whole world. And of course, if I had to choose, I'd probably choose Biden over Trump, but I don't want anyone to have that power, right? Like, so I think it's really important to not think that it's solved by having a better individual in that power. It's not the administration that is the problem, it's the weapon that is the problem, really. So the threat still continues. However, I do think that, of course, there could be an opening in terms of a less hostile administration. The Trump administration was extremely hostile to this treaty, actually, really pressured countries, probably like Australia as well, to not join the treaty. So hopefully a Biden administration will be more open to its allies joining the treaty and give a bit of confidence to an Australian government to pursue this treaty and thereby, contributing to nuclear disarmament.
Beatrice, in the few minutes we have left, do you mind speaking about, because we've mentioned a couple of times existing treaties, and we've spoken about the limitations of the existing regime as it is. Is the prohibition on nuclear weapons, do you see this as something that supersedes, for example, the non-proliferation treaty? Do you see it complementing existing side by side?
Well, it's very much building on to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. I mean, the NPT, as it's called, was negotiated in the late 60s. I think it opened for signature in 1970 or something like that, and was really a groundbreaking treaty, right? Like at that point, where the world was worried that within a decade or so, around 35 countries would have nuclear weapons. So it really did limit the spread of nuclear weapons. And in exchange for what was possible at that time was that these 5 recognized nuclear armed states said that we'll get rid of our nuclear weapons in exchange for no one else developing nuclear weapons. And we've had 4 more countries since then who have: India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. So it's been a very successful treaty. I mean, a lot of people like to talk about it as, you know, a failure, but in terms of the non-proliferation aspect of stopping new countries, you know, only 4 countries in the whole world out of 190 countries have are outside of this treaty. So that's pretty impressive. But it was never, I mean, it was even negotiated as a temporary treaty. It was supposed to last for 25 years and then was extended indefinitely after that. But it was never supposed to be the only thing. It even have in the article that states that the 5 nuclear armed states have to disarm their weapons. It said that they will be, they will engage in negotiations on this. So there was always a vision in this treaty, in the NPT treaty, that there will be follow-on agreements. And that has been through, like the New START, for example, reductions between US and Russia. And then, of course, also the TPNW, who puts nuclear weapons in the same way as chemical and biological weapons, a complete ban on the weapon. And I think it's really, so for us, I mean, these treaties are very complementary. It's a little bit like, you have a climate change agreement and then some countries go ahead and make tougher restrictions. That doesn't mean that you give up on the first one, right? It strengthens it. It's like we're going further and we're going to pull more countries with us. And when everyone has joined the TPNW, we've solved this problem. When every country has signed and ratified and implemented the TPNW, we have solved the problem of nuclear weapons. So for us, it's very much an extension of the work that was started in the 70s with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Time is not our friend, unfortunately. And before I wrap up this evening, based on some of the feedback we've had and the conversation that I've had with you this evening, despite the initially grim nature of what we're talking about, your enthusiasm is infectious, and that's been reflected on a number of the comments that we've had. And I think if the messages we can take away from tonight is that the importance of grassroots action, the importance of continually being aware, and the grassroots action being informed about the devastating effect and the horrible nature of these particular weapons. And the other part that I take away from this, which I think is always refreshing, is that we shouldn't always be looking to powerful countries to make a difference in the world. There are many ways in which we can make a difference. And this particular, and ICANN's work and what you've spoken to us about this evening are perfect examples of that. So thank you so very much to Beatrice Fihn. Also, thank you to the Australian Red Cross's Tara Goodman. This evening's talk will be available soon as a video and a podcast via the Island of Ideas website. At the next Island of Ideas seminar. Thank you so very much, everyone. Have a lovely evening.